Hello everyone, please tell me. Which city are you listening from? What time is it there? It was late, and I had just finished my shift at work, the kind of evening where the world outside feels muted, wrapped in the quiet of the night. The streets were almost empty, save for the occasional car passing by, its headlights cutting through the haze of streetlights and fog. I was walking home, my footsteps echoing softly on the wet pavement, the cool air brushing against my face. The rain had come and gone in waves throughout the day, leaving the world feeling a little more still, a little more soaked than usual, but it was peaceful, and I enjoyed the solitude. I walked the same route every evening through the quiet neighborhoods, down the familiar streets where the houses were mostly dark, their windows like empty eyes staring out into the night. It wasn't a particularly interesting walk, just the same rhythm, the same familiar sights, but tonight something caught my attention. As I passed an old stretch of street that I rarely walked down, there was a house, or what I thought was a house, standing at the end of the block. I had never noticed it before. It was an odd, squat building, one that looked like it had been abandoned for years. The paint was peeling from the walls, and the windows were thick with grime, as though they hadn't been cleaned in ages. The door, barely hanging on its hinges, was open just a crack, but it wasn't the house itself that drew my attention, it was the window. There in the second-story window, I saw a figure. At first I thought it was someone standing there, just barely visible through the dirt-covered glass, but the longer I stared at it, the more I realized something was off. The figure didn't move, it was perfectly still, its shape vague, but unmistakably a person, or at least what looked like one. I couldn't make out any details, no face, no limbs, just a dark silhouette, but what struck me wasn't how it looked, but how it didn't fit. The light from the street lamp cast long shadows across the house, but the figure remained starkly unaffected, like it was somehow detached from the reality around it. I stopped in my tracks, my eyes fixed on the window. I wasn't sure why, but the longer I looked, the more I felt drawn to it, like something was silently urging me to stay to see it more clearly. It didn't feel right, though. The longer I watched, the more uncomfortable I became. There was a heaviness in the air around me, an unexplainable stillness that made my chest tighten. I took a step forward, then another, my body moving on its own, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure didn't move, it didn't blink, it didn't shift, not even slightly. I started to walk closer to the building, my feet feeling heavier with every step, but as I reached the yard I froze again, the chill running up my spine. This time not from the cold, but from something else. The closer I got, the more I realized that the house wasn't real, not in the way I had first thought. It wasn't the house that was wrong, it was the window. There was no building, the figure was standing in the window of what should have been a second-floor room, but there was no second floor, there was no upper part of the house at all. I looked up and saw nothing but the dark sky, the only light coming from the street lamp behind me. The window was set into thin air, an illusion of space, but there was no actual structure supporting it. It was as if it were floating in the darkness, the figure standing in the middle of it, still as stone, its shape fading into the shadows. I felt my breath catch in my throat, my pulse quickened, and I turned to leave, but something stopped me. There was no sound, the world was dead. Silent, but the quiet had shifted. It was suffocating, thick and oppressive, like the air had been drawn out of the street itself. My feet were rooted to the ground, unwilling to move. I glanced back at the window, and this time the figure wasn't just standing still, it had noticed me. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its gaze. It was as though it had shifted its attention, turning directly toward me, and suddenly I was aware of a presence that wasn't just confined to the window, but was somehow all around me. It wasn't a feeling of being watched, it was a feeling of being known, like this thing, this figure understood something about me that I didn't know yet. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and instinctually I took a step back, wanting to leave, wanting to get away from whatever that thing was, but my feet wouldn't move. My heart was beating so loudly in my chest that I thought it might burst. I felt a weight in the air that pressed down on my body, something suffocating and cold, as if the entire night had drawn itself closer, enclosing me in this strange, unexplainable space. And then, just as I thought I might turn to run, the figure disappeared just like that, in the blink of an eye. It was gone, the window was empty. The house, which had already seemed strange, now looked even more out of place, its warped structure hanging in the air, as though it had never truly existed. I backed away, my breath shallow and quick, not daring to take my eyes off the empty window. I didn't know where to look or what to do, but I felt the overwhelming urge to leave, to get away from whatever had just happened. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the pavement, my mind racing to make sense of what I had just seen. But when I reached the end of the block and turned back to look, the house was gone. The spot where it had stood, the one I had stared at for what felt like hours, was now empty, just an ordinary stretch of street, dark and quiet, with nothing out of place. And yet I could still feel the weight of that gaze, the chill of it lingering in the pit of my stomach, as though the figure were still out there waiting. I don't walk down that street anymore. I avoid the spot where the house was, and I try not to think about the window that wasn't supposed to exist. But sometimes when the night is quiet, and the wind is just right, I can still feel those eyes staring at me from somewhere in the dark, and I know deep down that whatever it was I saw, it wasn't over. It was a typical Saturday afternoon in the city, the kind where the streets are bustling with people out running errands, meeting friends, or just enjoying the rare moments of sunshine. I had taken the train into the heart of town, planning to do a bit of window shopping and grab a coffee at my favorite cafe. The city was alive, as it always was, with the hum of conversations, the distant honking of horns, and the steady thrum of footsteps on the pavement. The square near the station was packed. Tourists and locals alike crowded around the outdoor market stalls, picking through fruits, vegetables, and handmade crafts. The air smelled of freshly baked bread, and I found myself slowing my pace, drawn in by the sights and sounds of the market. I enjoyed these moments of anonymity, where I could simply blend into the crowd, a faceless observer in the sea of people. As I walked past a group of people gathered near the edge of the market, something unusual caught my eye. She stood in the crowd, but it was the way she stood that made my steps falter. She was tall, with dark hair pulled back into a neat ponytail, dressed in a simple black coat and jeans. At first, there was nothing particularly striking about her. She blended in perfectly with the others around her, but as I passed by, something felt off. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but it stopped me in my tracks. She was standing perfectly still, her eyes fixed on something in the distance, but there was a strange emptiness to her, the kind of stillness that made her seem out of place, as though she wasn't fully part of the world around her. I turned my head slightly, my gaze lingering on her for just a moment longer than I should have. That's when I noticed it. Her shadow wasn't there. The crowd around her moved in every direction, people bustling past, casting their shadows across the pavement. The sunlight was bright, but instead of seeing her shadow stretching out behind her, there was only the bare stone of the sidewalk beneath her feet. The world around her was full of shadows, but hers was missing an empty spot on the pavement where it should have been. I blinked, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was just an odd trick of the light. I thought maybe I was standing in just the right spot where her shadow couldn't be cast, but no, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I kept walking, but my gaze was still drawn to her, my curiosity growing with every step. I couldn't take my eyes off her, and as I moved further down the square, I realized I couldn't quite remember when she had started standing there, when she had first come into my line of sight. I had been walking through the crowd without paying much attention, but somehow she had anchored my attention without any apparent reason. I stopped again, pretending to look at some merchandise from a nearby stall, but keeping her in the corner of my eye. I didn't want to stare directly at her. It felt wrong somehow, like I was intruding, but the strange emptiness of her shadowless figure tugged at me, making it impossible to ignore. A few minutes passed, and the crowd seemed to shift around her, people brushing past, moving on with their day, but she didn't move. Her eyes never left that same distant point, her posture stiff, unmoving. It felt like I was the only one who had noticed, like no one else saw the thing that stood out to me so clearly. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to look away. I was being ridiculous. I thought it was just a weird coincidence, a trick of perception. I was letting my mind wander into strange places, but as I walked farther down the square, I glanced over my shoulder. She was still there, standing in the same spot, her body unmoving. Her eyes were still locked on that distant place, and still there was no shadow beneath her. At this point, the oddness of the situation began to gnaw at me. I didn't know what I was afraid of, but there was a chill in my chest, an unease that had begun to settle in. I told myself it was just some odd lighting, a simple misperception that anyone might experience. Yet the longer I thought about it, the more unsettling it felt. I found a bench near the edge of the square and sat down, pulling my coat tighter around me, trying to shake the chill. The shadows were getting longer as the sun began to set, the light softening, but even as I watched the crowd ebb and flow, I couldn't stop thinking about her. I felt a strange pull, as though I was being drawn back to that spot to look at her again. Finally, after what felt like hours, I stood up and began to walk back toward where she had been standing. My feet moving of their own accord. The crowd had thinned by now, and the square was quieter, the voices fading into the distance. I reached the spot where I had seen her, but she wasn't there anymore. The area was empty, the pavement stretching out in front of me, but no sign of the woman, no trace of her. It was as if she had never been there at all. I looked around, scanning the empty square, but there was nothing, no figure standing still in the crowd, no shadowless presence. I glanced at my watch, but only a few minutes had passed since I had walked away. It was as if she had vanished into thin air, leaving nothing behind but the lingering discomfort in my chest. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what I had just experienced, unsure of what I had seen. Had I really seen it? Had she ever really been there? And then, as I turned to leave, I felt it again, prickle of something unfamiliar at the back of my neck, a sensation that for some reason I couldn't shake, the feeling that somehow she was still there, watching, even if I couldn't see her anymore. I walked quickly away from the square, the shadows of the evening stretching out in front of me, but I couldn't rid myself of the feeling that something had been left behind, something that couldn't be explained, and no matter how far I walked, I couldn't stop thinking about the woman without a shadow. It was one of those evenings where the city seemed to be holding its breath. The air was still, the usual hum of traffic having tapered off with the setting sun. It was that perfect time right after rush hour, when the streets quieted down and the world seemed to take a pause before the night fully settled in. I had just finished dinner at a small restaurant on the corner and was heading home, my footsteps light on the damp pavement. I had always enjoyed the walk back from that restaurant. The route wasn't too far from my apartment, just a few blocks, but the streets were empty enough to give a sense of peace, amidst the usual hustle and bustle. The occasional car passed by its headlights cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing remarkable about the walk, just the usual quiet streets, bathed in the soft glow of streetlights and the distant hum of the city beyond. But tonight something was different. I hadn't noticed it at first, but as I continued down the sidewalk, I became aware of a subtle shift in the air. It wasn't a tangible change, but something about the night felt off. The silence that usually settled over the streets felt thicker, more oppressive, as though it were holding something back. I slowed my pace, feeling a strange sense of unease creeping up my spine, the kind of feeling that you get when you're alone, and you realize you're being watched, even though you can't see anyone. The faint sounds of the city's hum of distant traffic, the occasional shout from a nearby allayed all but disappeared. The streets were eerily quiet now, almost too quiet. I glanced around, but there was no one in sight. The block was empty, the usual lights from apartment windows dim, as if everyone had gone to bed early, but there was still something unsettling in the silence, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. And then I heard it, a single footstep. It was so faint at first I almost dismissed it as my imagination, but there it was again, another footstep. The sound was soft, but it was there, unmistakable in the stillness of the night. My heart rate quickened. I stopped in my tracks, my ears straining to pick up any other sounds. I turned around, half expecting to see someone behind me, but the street was still empty. The footstep was followed by another, and then another, each one growing louder and closer. Someone was running, but the sound was stringite, wasn't hurried or erratic. It was methodical, measured. I could hear the rhythm of it. The consistent thudding of feet hitting the pavement, almost like someone was pacing themselves as they moved through the night. I looked around, again, my stomach tightening. The street ahead of me was empty, and the shadows from the streetlights stretched long and dark along the sidewalk. There was no one in sight, but the sound of running grew louder. With each step, the footfalls now almost too clear, too close. I turned on my heel, picking up my pace, my breath quickening. I told myself it was just someone else out for a late-night jog, that it was nothing to worry about. But then the running seemed to match my pace, like it was following me. I picked up my speed, but the sound of the footsteps followed suit, now right behind me, just out of sight. My heart was pounding in my chest, my eyes darting around as I searched the empty street, but there was no one there. The rhythm of the footsteps became almost hypnotic, the sound of them echoing through the quiet streets, growing louder. With every stride, I broke into a light jog, my breath shallow and quick, trying to outrun whatever it was that was following me. But the footsteps never faltered. They matched my every move, closing the distance between us. I rounded a corner, hoping to find some kind of refuge, but the sound of the footsteps was there too. They were right behind me now, but I couldn't see anyone. My pulse was racing, and the street, once calm and quiet, now felt like a dark tunnel, the silence oppressive and thick with dread. The sound of running grew louder, the footfalls almost deafening in the night, but I still couldn't see a thing. No one was there. I couldn't make sense of could someone be running so close to me, matching my every step, and yet remain invisible? I turned another corner, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer, but the footsteps followed. They didn't slow down. They didn't hesitate. They simply kept coming closer and closer. I reached a dead-ender, narrow alley with tall buildings On either side, my heart thudded in my chest, my breath ragged. I was trapped. I turned around to face the alley, my eyes searching for any sign of movement, any indication that someone was there, and then, just as I was about to turn to run again, the footsteps stopped. The sudden silence was suffocating. I stood there, my chest heaving, the cold air rushing into my lungs. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the alley, but there was nothing, no one. The street was empty again, the sound of running gone. As quickly as it had come. I don't know how long I stood there, staring into the darkness, my heart pounding in my ears. The world around me had returned to its unnerving stillness, but the sense of unease hadn't left me. I slowly backed away, my feet moving instinctively, not daring to look back. When I reached the main street again, I turned and walked briskly, my pace quickening with every step. The sound of running hadn't returned, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was still following me, just out of sight, just beyond reach. And as I walked, I couldn't help but feel the strange, lingering presence of something waiting just behind me, its footsteps echoing softly in the still night air. It was a quiet evening, the kind where the world seems to fade into a gentle hush as the city settles down for the night. I was walking down the main street of my neighborhood, the familiar path that I had taken so many times before. The stores were beginning to close for the night, their windows dark except for a few stray lights casting soft glows onto the sidewalk. The weather was mild, and the air felt like it was wrapped in a thin layer of fog that hung low, making everything look just a little softer, a little more distant. I was almost home, lost in thought, when something caught my eye. It was a small, unassuming store near the end of the block. I had never really noticed before. The storefront was old, its window slightly fogged, with shelves full of knickknacks and trinkets on display. There was nothing particularly special about it, but for some reason I found myself slowing down as I passed by. Something about the store's window intrigued me. The items inside seemed oddly familiar, like things I had seen in my grandmother's house when I was younger. Old porcelain dolls, tarnished silverware, books with worn covers, the kinds of things you don't see much anymore, things that feel like they belong to another time. I stopped in front of the window, staring at the display. The more I looked, the more I felt like something was off, but I couldn't place it. There was a strange feeling, like I was being drawn into the window, as though the store was quietly beckoning me to come closer. I leaned in a little, peering through the glass. And that's when I saw it. A figure. At first, I thought it was just a reflection, the light from the street lamp behind me distorting the glass, but when I blinked, the figure didn't disappear. It was standing in the corner of the store, just behind a tall shelf stacked with old books. At first, I couldn't make out any details. The figure was just a silhouette in the dim light, but there was something about the way it stood, so still, so perfectly motionless, that sent a shiver up my spine. I leaned closer, squinting to try and make out where what it was. My breath fogged up the glass slightly as I moved my face closer to the window. The figure was still there, its face shadowed and unrecognizable, but the feeling that it was watching me sent a cold wave of unease through my chest. I couldn't shake the sensation that it knew I was there, that it was aware of me, even though I hadn't seen it move an inch. I pulled back quickly, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched, but as I stepped back, I found myself frozen in place, my heart suddenly thudding against my ribs. The figure was still there in me now. It wasn't just standing motionless, it was looking directly at me in the window's reflection. I could see its eyes clear now, dark and hollow, staring right at me. The sight of them made my stomach lurch. They weren't just eyes, they felt like they were seeing me, looking through me, as if they could peer into something deeper than Just my outward appearance. I felt a creeping sensation like the space between me and the figure had shrunk, as if the window no longer existed, and it was only a matter of time before it stepped out of the store and into the street. I turned to walk away, my feet suddenly heavy, but something stopped me. I couldn't look away. My eyes locked onto the figures, and despite every instinct telling me to leave, I found myself slowly moving back toward the window, unable to break the connection. I couldn't explain it, this irrational pull, this force that kept me there staring into that dimly lit store. I reached the window again, my hands trembling as I placed them against the cold glass. The figure hadn't moved, but the air around me felt charged, almost electric, as though something was about to happen, something I couldn't control. I leaned in closer, my breath fogging up the glass once more. That's when I saw it. The figure's eyes blinked. I froze, my heart skipped a beat, my chest tightening as I stood there breathless, staring at it. I couldn't look away, not even if I wanted to. The figure blinked again, and slowly a smile crept across its face, a slow, deliberate smile that didn't reach its eyes. The movement was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but the more I watched, the more the smile stretched until it became something twisted, something wrong. The smile wasn't human. It wasn't even a real smile. It was something else, something that shouldn't have been there, twisting its way across the figure's face like a mask. My pulse quickened, and I stumbled backward, my back hitting the cold brick wall of the building behind me. I had to get away. This wasn't right. I turned and ran down the street, not looking back, until I reached the corner. My breath came in short gasps, my heart pounding, and even though I told myself I had to leave it behind, I couldn't shake the image of those eyes, of that smile. I tried to forget about the store, to push it out of my mind, but every time I passed that street corner, I couldn't help but glance toward the window. The store was still there, the same as ever, but I never saw the figure again. I never saw it again, but I could feel it lurking behind the glass, waiting, and every time I walked by that window, no matter how much time passed, I felt like I was being watched, like the eyes of the figure were still there, still seeing me. Maybe I was imagining it. I thought maybe it was just a trick of the light, my mind playing games, but something about that moment, something about the way those eyes had looked at me, told me that whatever had been in that store wasn't gone. It was still there, and it was still watching, and every time I passed that window, I couldn't help but wonder if one day I would see those eyes staring back at me again. It was a cold evening in late autumn, the kind where the wind bites at your skin, and the world feels just a little too quiet. The streets were slick with rain, reflecting the dim lights from the scattered lampposts, their glow bouncing off the wet pavement like small pools of amber. I had just left the cafe I frequented, my mind still swirling with thoughts of the long day. I didn't have far to go, just a few blocks before I'd reach my apartment, but tonight, for some reason, everything felt a little off. The streets were emptier than usual, with only a few cars passing by, their tires hissing as they cut through the wet road. As I walked, my footsteps echoing in the stillness of the evening, I passed a narrow alleyway, barely wide enough for two people to walk side by side. It was the kind of alley that people usually avoidedly littered with old boxes and forgotten pieces of furniture. The scent of damp stone and trash lingered in the air, the smell of decay that felt permanent. I felt permanent. I had walked by this alley countless times, but tonight it felt different. It was as if the shadows in that small space were heavier than usual, as if they were pulling the light away, making it seem even darker. I was about to continue on my way when I noticed a woman standing at the entrance of the alley. She was alone, her figure silhouetted against the faint light from the street, her coat long and flowing like something out of an old photograph. She was facing away from me, staring into the darkness of the alley, as if waiting for something or someone. Her posture was stiff, and even from a distance I could see that something was wrong. There was no movement from her, no sign of life beyond the stillness. I stopped for a moment, curious, though I couldn't say why. There was something strange about the way she stood there, almost too composed, like she belonged to the night, a figure waiting to fade into it. I thought about calling out to her to ask if she needed help, but something stopped me. It was an odd feeling, almost as if the air itself was telling me not to intrude. Just as I was about to move on, she stepped forward, her heels clicking softly on the wet ground. Without looking back, she entered the alley, disappearing into the shadows. With a slow, deliberate stride, I watched her for a moment, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the alley, until it was swallowed by the silence. I stood there for a moment, an inexplicable sense of dread creeping up my spine. I couldn't explain it, but something about the way she walked, the way she vanished into the alley without a glance behind her, felt wrong. I shrugged it off, trying to convince myself that it was nothing, that I was just being overly cautious. After all, people walked into alleys all the time, especially in this part of the city, but something lingered in the back of my mind as I continued down the street. I couldn't shake the image of her figure disappearing into the dark. I glanced back toward the alley, half expecting to see her again walking back out, but there was nothing, just the empty street and the fading echo of her footsteps. The next day, I didn't think much about it. Life moved on, and I had other things on my mind, but when I passed that same alley again, I couldn't help but glance down it. The entrance was still as dark and empty as before, the shadows deepening at the edges, where the streetlights couldn't reach. It was a cold, dreary afternoon, and the alley seemed even more oppressive. Then I remembered I was about to turn away, but something made me stop. My eyes traced the length of the alley, searching for any sign of life, and then I saw something at the far end of the alley, where the darkness seemed the thickest. I thought I saw a figure. It was her. I didn't move at first, just standing there, my breath catching in my throat. There she was again, standing motionless, staring into the shadows at the far end of the alley. Her coat billowed slightly in the wind, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw her head turn, as if she was looking at me, but when I blinked, she was gone, vanished. I stood frozen, not sure what to make of it. My pulse quickened, and I couldn't seem to tear my eyes away from the spot where she had been standing. I was certain I had seen her, even if just for a moment. The alley was empty again, but the feeling of unease stayed with me, lingering in my chest, heavy and cold. I didn't linger long. I walked quickly, my steps hurried, trying to push the strange encounter from my mind. But as the days went on, I couldn't stop thinking about her, the woman in the alley, the way she moved, the way she seemed to vanish into the shadows without a trace. And then a week later, I saw it in the news. A woman had gone missing. She was last seen walking down the street, and the police were searching for any leads. The description matched the woman I had seen, the one who had stepped into the dark alley, never to come back out, the same one who had vanished without a trace. I froze when I saw the news report. It was impossible. I thought the alley, could it be the same one? I tried to convince myself that it was just a coincidence, that the woman in the news was someone else entirely, but deep down I knew. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen her that night, standing in the alley, just before she disappeared, the same woman who was now gone, swallowed up by the city. To this day, I avoid that alley. I don't walk down that street anymore, and I don't think I ever will. But sometimes when I'm walking through the city late at night, I can't help but glance toward it, the shadows still stretch long, and the silence feels a little too heavy every time I pass by. I wonder if I'll ever see her again, the woman who walked into the dark alley but never came out. It was a typical Tuesday evening, one of those nights where everything seems to move at its own pace, without any particular urgency. I had just finished work, and was heading home tired, but content with the rhythm of my day. The train station was busy as it usually was at this time, with people bustling around, their faces tired but determined. I could hear the clattering of suitcases on the ground, the hum of conversations, and the distant sound of train announcements echoing through the station. I wasn't in a rush. The train I needed wouldn't be leaving for another 15 minutes, so I found a quiet spot near the platform to wait. It was a standard evening commute, nothing remarkable about it at all. I had my headphones in, but I wasn't listening to anything in particular, just letting the world pass me by. As I checked my phone for any new messages or notifications when the train finally pulled into the station, I stood up and made my way toward it, walking with the crowd, the usual shuffle of people all headed in the same direction. The train door slid open with a soft hiss, and I stepped inside, my eyes scanning for a seat. It was crowded as expected, but not unbearably so. I found a spot by the window, settled into my seat, and let out a quiet sigh of relief. The train's engine hummed to life, and we started moving, heading out of the station and into the night. It was then that I noticed something strange. The train was full, too full really. People were crammed in, standing and sitting as they usually would during the evening rush, but as I looked around, I realized that no one was speaking, no one was making eye contact. The usual low murmur of voices, the shuffle of feet, the soft rustling of bags, none of it was there. The only sound was the mechanical hum of the train, the click of the tracks beneath us. At first I thought it was just the quiet of a late-night train ride. Maybe the day had worn people down, and they were all too tired to talk. But the more I looked around, the more unsettling it became. The passengers weren't just silent, they were motionless. I glanced at the person sitting across from me, middle-aged man with a briefcase in his lap, and I realized that his eyes were fixed on a point ahead of him, unblinking, not moving at all. His face was expressionless, but there was something off about him. He was stiff, as if he were frozen in place, not even acknowledging the movement of the train, or the slight swaying as it picked up speed. I turned my gaze to the others, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease. A woman in the seat next to me, her arms folded tightly in front of her, was staring out the window. Her reflection in the glass was pale, her eyes distant. Beside her, a teenager was hunched over, staring down at the floor, his hoodie pulled up over his head, but he didn't seem to move. No fidgeting, no shifting in his seat. It was as if the whole car had been emptied of life, leaving only these still, silent figures. I swallowed, feeling a chill creep up my spine. I had always found the quiet of late-night train rides comforting, but this wasn't just quiet, it was oppressive. The silence felt heavy, like it was pushing against me, making it hard to breathe. It was as if the passengers weren't even aware of each other, like they were ghosts trapped in their own stillness. I looked back toward the front of the train. The conductor was at the front, standing motionless by the door, his face pale and his posture rigid. He wasn't checking tickets, wasn't making announcements. He just stood there, unmoving, staring ahead, as if there were nothing in the world that could make him budge. The door behind him was open, but I couldn't see the usual light of the station or any other train cars. There was only the dark tunnel ahead, stretching out into nothingness. I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of my mind. Maybe I was exhausted, or maybe it was just my imagination running wild. But no matter how I tried to reason with myself, I couldn't shake the growing sense of dread. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Suddenly the train seemed to lurch, as though it had hit a bump or shifted on the tracks. I grabbed the armrest to steady myself, but the movement was subtle, almost imperceptible. It wasn't enough to jolt anyone awake, or even make them blink, but it was enough to make my stomach drop. The hum of the train grew louder, almost deafening, as if it was closing in around me. I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up, deciding to make my way to the next car to get away from the strange stillness, but as I moved toward the door, I realized something. The door didn't open. I pushed the handle, but it was stuck, as if it were locked from the other side. I stepped back and tried again, my mind racing, but no matter how hard I pulled, the door wouldn't budge. I turned to look at the other passengers again. They hadn't moved. No one had moved. A wave of panic washed over me, and I spun around, heading toward the front of the train. I needed to talk to the conductor, needed to understand what was happening, but as I reached the front of the car, I stopped dead in my tracks. The conductor was gone. The space where he had been standing was empty. There was no sign of him at all. I turned around, looking back down the train, my heart thudding in my chest. And that's when I saw a thing that made my blood run cold. The entire train had disappeared. There were no windows, no doors, no walls, just an endless stretch of empty space. The train car, the passengers, the seats, everything was gone, replaced by nothingness. The dark tunnel was still there, but it wasn't a tunnel I recognized. It wasn't the same train route I had been on. The hum of the train was gone now, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed against my ears. I was standing in the middle of an empty space, a place that felt wrong. My breath was shallow, my mind scrambling for an explanation, but I couldn't find one. There was no sound, no movement, only the cold, unyielding darkness stretching out in every direction. And then I heard it, a sound that pierced the silence, clear and unmistakable. Sound of footsteps. They were soft at first, barely audible, but they were there, and they were coming closer. I turned, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing behind me, no one. The footsteps continued, though the sound growing louder with each passing second, as though someone was running toward me, but I couldn't see a single figure in the dark. The footsteps were getting closer, until I could feel the air around me stir with their presence. And then, just before the footsteps reached me, the world stopped. The silence returned, and everything was still. I woke up in my bed, drenched in sweat, my heart still racing. I looked around the room, disoriented, the soft glow of the early morning sunlight filtering through the curtains. The world outside was quiet, just like it always was at this hour, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I couldn't shake the memory of the train, of the footsteps, of the cold emptiness that had stretched out before me. And even though I was awake, I couldn't escape the feeling that somewhere that train was still out there waiting for me. It was a late autumn evening, the kind where the chill in the air seems to sink right into your bones, and the sun sets earlier than you'd like, leaving the streets bathed in a strange twilight. I was walking home from the grocery store, a bag of fresh bread and vegetables tucked under my arm, the quiet streets of my neighborhood stretching out in front of me. It had been a long day, and the walk was a welcome escape. The cool air, refreshing after being cooped up inside all afternoon. As I made my way down the street, I passed by an old building that I'd seen countless times before. It was one of those places that looked like it had been abandoned for years, its stone facade cracked and weathered, the windows dirty with grime. The building had been empty for as long as I could remember, a hollow shell of what it might have once been, a store, a warehouse, maybe even a home. I wasn't sure. It was just there, one of those quiet reminders of the past that seemed to have slipped through time. unnoticed, but tonight, as I walked by, something caught my attention. The lights were on inside. It wasn't a flicker or a stray bulb left on by mistake. There were multiple lights, bright, warm lights glowing from within the building, spilling out through the dusty windows and casting long, strange shadows on the sidewalk. It was odd, to say the least. The building had been abandoned for as long as I could remember, and I had never once seen anyone enter or exit it. No sign of life, just empty windows, and the occasional creak of the old building settling in the wind. I stopped in my tracks, my footsteps coming to an abrupt halt. I stood there for a moment, staring at the lights, trying to make sense of it. Maybe someone had decided to renovate it. It seemed unlikely, but there was no other explanation for the lights. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone moving around inside, but there was no sign of anyone in the windows. The lights just stayed on, steady and bright, casting an eerie glow into the otherwise dark street. I didn't know why, but something about the scene made me uneasy. I was standing there, frozen for longer than I cared to admit, when I suddenly realized that the light from the building was spilling out too far. Too much. It wasn't just the windows anymore. The light was spilling out onto the street, onto the ground beneath my feet. The edges of the sidewalk closest to the building seemed to glow faintly, like the building itself was reaching out into the darkness. I shook my head, feeling foolish. I had just imagined it, or perhaps it was some trick of the mind, some misinterpretation of the shadows in the dimming light of the evening. I turned to continue walking, but then a thought flashed through my mind, something so fleeting, I almost missed it. The front door of the building, which had always been tightly shut and boarded up, was slightly ajar. I stood still, the bag of groceries feeling heavier in my hand. I didn't know why, but I was compelled to look. I walked closer to the building, my feet moving slowly, cautiously, as if I were afraid the ground might open up beneath me. The door was barely open, just a crack, but it was enough to make me wonder why it was open at all. I had never seen that door open before. I hesitated, my hand instinctively reaching toward the doorframe, my heart pounding in my chest. Something about this felt wrong, in a way I couldn't quite explain, as if the world around me had tilted just slightly, and I was now standing on the edge of something I wasn't meant to see. I glanced inside, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. The interior of the building was just as I remembered: old shelves, broken furniture, and piles of debris scattered across the floor. But the those lights were still burning brightly, casting long shadows over the dusty, decaying walls. It wasn't just the front room that was lit. I could see that the lights stretched deep into the building, as though someone had turned on every single bulb, every single lamp, filling the space with an unnatural glow. I couldn't move. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring into the building, my breath shallow and quick. The air was still heavy with an unspoken wait. The door was open now, wide enough for someone to slip through, but I felt an overwhelming sense of hesitation. There was something in the back of my mind that told me I shouldn't go in, something instinctual, telling me to walk away, to keep moving, but my feet didn't move. It wasn't until I heard a sound that I snapped out of my trance. A faint noise, barely audible at first, but unmistakable. It was the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, echoing from inside the building, the rhythmic sound of someone walking toward the door. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't know why, but I knew I wasn't alone. I spun around and ran, my footsteps echoing in the stillness of the street. As I hurried away from the building, I didn't dare look back, but I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me, as though something's still watching, still waiting. My breath came in ragged bursts as I rounded the corner and disappeared into the next street, the lights from the building still burning brightly in my mind. I didn't look back. I didn't tell anyone about it. I didn't have the words to explain what had happened, or what I had felt, or why the light had been on inside an abandoned building. Maybe I was just tired, maybe my mind had been playing tricks on me, but every time I walk past that building now, I can't help but glance at it, my heart beating just a little faster. The door is always closed now, but I can't shake the feeling that it's not the last time I'll see the lights on inside, and that whatever's in there is still waiting. It was a quiet night, the kind of night that holds its breath, where the only sounds are the rustle of the leaves in the trees and the distant hum of streetlights cutting through the dark. I had just left a friend's house, the streets empty and still. The city in that peaceful lull between the rush of the day and the quiet of the night. The moon hung low in the sky, casting its pale light over the pavement as I walked alone, the only sound, the soft tap of my shoes on the wet sidewalk. I had walked this route 1,000 times before, but tonight the street felt different. It wasn't anything obvious, just a strange, uncomfortable stillness in the air. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the familiar buildings around me, and the comforting sound of my own footsteps. I passed the old crooked house on the corner, the one that always gave me an uneasy feeling, though I couldn't explain why. Its windows were dark and the yard was overgrown, but nothing out of the ordinary. But then, just as I passed the house, I felt a shift in the air, something cold, something unfamiliar. The feeling crept up my spine, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I stopped, my breath catching for a moment as the sensation washed over me, a chill that didn't seem to come from the night air. I glanced around, but the street was empty, no cars, no people. Just the quiet hum of the city in the distance. I turned to continue on my way, but that's when I heard it. A voice. It came from the shadows, from the very edge of my vision, where the light from the street lamp faded into the dark. At first I thought it was my imagination, a trick of the mind, but then the voice came again, soft like a whisper, but distinct. Help me. I froze, my heart leaping in my chest. The voice was clear, yet it was so soft, so distant. It felt like it was coming from the very air around me. I looked around, but no one was there. The street was empty, the shadows stretching long and dark on the pavement. I stepped forward cautiously, drawn in by the voice, though a part of me screamed to turn around and walk away. The voice came again, a little louder this time, but still so faint, as if it were just a breath in the wind. Help me, please. I looked down the street, trying to see where it was coming from, but the shadows were thick. My pulse quickened, my breath shallow. I felt the urge to call out, to ask if someone needed help, but the strange, unsettled feeling in my chest made it hard to move. The voice wasn't just calling to me, it felt like it was reaching for me, like it was pulling me toward the darkness. I took a step closer, my eyes scanning the street, the shadows, but still no one. I was alone, or so I thought. The voice was close now, just ahead, just to the left. Barely audible, yet so persistent, like it was coming from just behind the corner of the house. I moved toward the corner slowly, my feet carrying me forward against my better judgment. My hands were trembling, my heart pounding harder. Now the voice seemed to grow clearer with every step I took, each whisper laced with desperation. Please. I reached the edge of the house, my breath catching in my throat. As I looked into the darkness, the shadows were thick. Here the street lamp barely reaching the corner, leaving most of the house covered in blackness. I strained my ears, listening for the voice again, but it was silent now. The stillness returned, almost oppressive. And then I saw her. She was standing just at the edge of the shadows, barely visible, but there I could make out the faint outline of a woman, her figure outlined by the dim light from the street lamp. Though her features were hard to make out in the dark, she was dressed in a long coat, her face hidden beneath the brim of Her hands were clasped together in front of her, and she stood still, staring at me. She wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. "Help me," she whispered again, her voice barely audible, like it was coming from the deepest part of the night. I stepped closer, my heart racing now. There was something unnerving about the way she stood so still, so silent in the shadows. I opened my mouth to speak, to ask if she needed help, but when I did, I froze. No sound came out. I looked around. The street was still empty. There was no one else. The only thing I could hear now was the soft rush of the wind, the quiet murmur of the world around me. The woman didn't move, but the silence stretched longer. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, like her eyes were burning into me, even though I couldn't see them clearly. "Please," she whispered again, the words barely a breath. Her voice was so soft, yet it echoed in my mind louder than anything I had ever heard. And then, as if in a trance, I stepped forward, closer to her. I reached out my hand, trembling, wanting to touch her, to help her to understand why she was standing there in the shadows. But before I could get any closer, the figure faded, not like someone walking away, but like she had been swallowed by the darkness itself. One moment she was there, the next there was nothing, no figure, no presence, just the empty space where she had stood. The shadows in the corner of the house were still unmoving. I stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, staring at the empty spot where she had been. The air felt suddenly colder, and the world around me felt wrong, as if something had shifted. Something I couldn't explain. The voice had stopped. The figure had disappeared. I turned and walked quickly away, not daring to look back. My pulse was pounding in my ears, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, just beyond my vision. The city around me felt too quiet, too still. Every shadow seemed to move. Every corner felt like it was hiding something. When I got home, I tried to shake it off. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that I was tired, that the darkness had played tricks on me. But the voice, her presence lingered in my mind. It felt real, too real. I haven't walked down that street since, and every time I pass by it in my car, I can't help but glance toward the corner where I saw her. The shadows are always thicker there, and sometimes, just for a moment, I think I see something, a figure standing in the dark, just watching, but when I blink, it's always gone. It started on a Tuesday after work, when I decided to take a different route home. It wasn't anything major, just a detour to avoid the usual traffic jam. I always seemed to get stuck, and the weather was nice, the kind of early evening where the sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving a soft purple sky, and the streetlights flickered on, casting warm pools of light on the pavement. I was in no rush, just wanting to enjoy the quiet walk for once, without the usual chaos of cars honking and people rushing past. I turned onto a street I hadn't walked down in a while, the one that ran parallel to my usual route. It was a residential area, quiet and tree-lined, with old houses on either side, the kind of place where you could almost hear the history in the crumbling brick walls and overgrown hedges. I'd been down this street many times before, but something felt off. It wasn't anything you could put your finger on at first, but the air felt heavier, more stifling, as though the day's warmth had stayed too long, lingering in the corners of the neighborhood. I was walking slowly, my hands in my pockets, letting my mind wander, when I saw the street sign at the next intersection. It didn't say what it should have. I paused for a moment, blinking. As I tried to make sense of it, the sign was supposed to read Briarwood Avenue, the usual name for the street I was about to cross, but now it said Hollow Street. I stared at it for a while, convinced my eyes were playing tricks on me. I had lived in this city for years. I knew these streets, knew them by heart. There was no Hollow Street here. I was certain of it. But when I looked down the road, the street was just as it always had been, silent, the sidewalks slightly cracked, and the houses sitting still in the dimming light. It was the same stretch of road I had walked down countless times, yet the sign had changed. I shook my head, trying to shrug it off. Maybe I had misread it, or maybe I was just more tired than I realized. I checked the next street sign, just to be sure, and this time it was correct, Briarwood Avenue. I breathed a small sigh of relief, and continued walking, my pace quickening a little, eager to push the strange moment from my mind. But then it happened again. The next intersection was another one I recognized, and when I glanced up at the street sign, it read Hollow Street once more. The same name, the same eerie feeling settled in my stomach. There was no way this could be happening. I had walked this route countless times. I knew this neighborhood. Hollow Street wasn't part of it. I was sure of that. My mind was racing, my pulse quickening, as I glanced back down the street toward Briarwood Avenue. The houses still stood there unchanged, but the air felt different now. Colder this time. I stopped. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but there was no rational explanation for what I was seeing. I turned around and looked back at the intersection I had just crossed. The sign there once again was different. It read Hollow Street instead of Briarwood Avenue. This time, I turned around, completely intending to head back home to get away from whatever was going on, but no matter which direction I took, I found myself walking down the same street, following the same path. The buildings, the houses, they all looked familiar, but the street signs kept changing, repeating the same name over and over, Hollow Street. It was as if the street itself was folding in on itself, distorting, pulling me back into the same place. No matter how hard I tried to leave, I felt trapped. My breath came in short, shallow bursts, the panic starting to take hold. I quickened my pace, moving faster, almost running, hoping that if I just kept walking, the street signs would change back, or that I'd find the end of it. But no matter where I went, no matter which direction I took, I ended up at the same intersection, the same street name, staring back at me in the dim light. I couldn't make sense of it. I had lived here long enough to know that this wasn't some mistake. The city wasn't like this. Streets didn't change names just because you walked down them. But here I was, standing in a loop, unable to escape. I don't know how much time passed. It felt like hours, but the city around me stayed frozen, unchanged. I finally decided to stop and take a deep breath to try and collect myself. I stood there staring at the sign in front of me, the cold creeping into my bones, my heart still racing. The panic was overwhelming, but somewhere deep inside I could still feel the weight of that familiarity, that certainty I had earlier. This street, these signs, they didn't belong here, but they were mine now, weren't they? I glanced up one last time, and for the briefest moment, something shifted. The street sign flickered, and when it cleared, it no longer read Hollow Street, it read Briarwood Avenue. Again I blinked, looking around, still standing in the middle of the street, unsure of where I was anymore. The panic in my chest didn't subside, but something inside of me wanted to believe that I was finally free of the loop, that I had somehow found my way back. I turned to walk toward home, the path ahead of me now clear, but as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that despite the sign returning to its proper name, I was still in that strange place, that this wasn't over, that whatever had twisted the street, whatever had led me through that endless loop, was still lingering just beyond the corner of my vision, and I wasn't sure when it would come back, but I could still hear the faint echo of my footsteps following me through the quiet streets, and I wondered just for a moment if I had truly left. It was late in the evening, and the city had taken on that quiet, almost unnerving stillness. that comes just before the world falls asleep. I had just finished a late dinner with friends, and, as usual, I found myself walking home alone. The streets were mostly empty save for a few cars passing by, their headlights casting long shadows across the sidewalks. The hum of the city seemed to fade with each step I took, leaving only the soft rustle of leaves and the distant sound of traffic somewhere. In the background, it was a peaceful night, cool with a slight breeze in the air. I was walking down the same route I always took, the familiar rhythm of my footsteps on the pavement providing a comforting, steady sound. I wasn't in a hurry. I rarely was when walking through my neighborhood at night. The world felt a little different at this hour, slower, quieter, with a certain magic in the way the city seemed to settle into its nighttime routine. But tonight something was off. I first noticed it when I passed the old church at the corner of the street. It wasn't unusual for me to walk by a tidy done so hundreds of times, but this time, as I neared the church, I had the strangest sensation. It wasn't a feeling I could explain easily, just a deep sense of unease that seemed to crawl up my spine. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Though I couldn't pinpoint what it was, I tried to push the feeling aside. It was just the quiet night playing tricks on my mind, I thought. But as I moved past the church, I heard it, a soft, measured tap-tap behind me, like footsteps. I froze. The sound was faint at first, barely audible, but it was there. The rhythm of it was so familiar, so human, that it made my pulse quicken. I turned my head instinctively, half expecting to see someone walking behind me, maybe another late-night traveler, someone else heading home like me. But when I looked, the street was empty. There was no one behind me, no one walking in my direction. I felt my stomach tighten. Maybe it was nothing, I told myself, just the sound of my own footsteps echoing in the stillness, some trick of perception. I shrugged it off, trying to shake the feeling that had settled in my chest. I began walking again, picking up my pace, hoping the sound was just a figment of my imagination. But then I heard it again. Tap, 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 closer. This time I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart suddenly thudding in my chest. The sound was unmistakable, boots right behind me. But when I turned around again, there was nothing, no one. The street was just as empty as it had been moments before, the dim light from the street lamps casting long shadows across the sidewalk. I took a step forward, my pulse racing, my mind spinning with confusion. Could I be hearing things? Was I just too tired, too lost in my own thoughts? I kept walking, my breath shallow, but the footsteps continued pacing me. Tap, tap, tap. They were there again, closer, matching my pace perfectly. Synchronized, I quickened my step, my legs feeling heavier with each stride, my skin prickling with an odd mixture of fear and frustration. I turned a corner, half expecting the footsteps to stop, but they didn't. They followed me, keeping time with my own hurried footsteps, as though someone was walking just behind me. But when I looked, there was no one. I felt a rush of panic. I was alone on this street, or at least I should have been. No one was supposed to be there, yet the sound was undeniable. Someone, or something, was right behind me, following me, matching my every movement. I broke into a run, my feet pounding against the pavement, the sound of my footsteps now drowned out by the relentless tapping behind me. The faster I ran, the closer the footsteps seemed to get. I could hear them so clearly now, like someone was right on my heels. But when I glanced over my shoulder, the street remained empty, bathed in the eerie glow of the streetlights. I turned another corner, desperate to lose whatever or whoever was following me. My heart was in my throat, my breath ragged, but the footsteps didn't stop. They were there, every step I took, always just behind me. Always too close. I could feel them, like a presence, like something moving in the shadows waiting for me to make a mistake. Finally, I reached my apartment building, my legs burning from the sprint, my head spinning with adrenaline. I fumbled for my keys, nearly dropping them in my panic. My hands shook as I finally unlocked the door, slamming it shut behind me. Once I was inside, I stood there for a moment, panting, my back pressed against the door, my mind racing. The apartment was silent. The world outside was quiet, no footsteps, no sounds at all. I thought it was over. I thought I was safe, but as I stood there catching my breath, I heard something else, a soft knock at the door, tap tap. I didn't move. My heart stopped for a moment, the sound of it too clear, too distinct. I waited, my breath held, but the knock didn't come again. The silence stretched on, thick and oppressive, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something. I didn't open the door, I didn't move. After a long, endless moment, I heard the footsteps again, not from outside, but from somewhere deeper in the apartment, coming from the hallway, tap tap, and then a voice, soft and barely audible, just above the sound of my own pulse. "I'm right behind you." I couldn't bring myself to turn around, I couldn't bring myself to look. The footsteps were closer now, and whatever was following me, whatever had been with me that night, was no longer behind me. It was standing right next to me, waiting for me to face it. It was an ordinary evening, the kind that feels peaceful in its quiet, with the city winding down after the usual hustle and bustle of the day. I had just left the local bookstore, my bag heavier than expected from the few books I had picked up. The sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow over the buildings, and making everything seem softer, almost dreamlike. I loved walking home during this time of day, when the world seemed to settle into a peaceful rhythm before the night fully arrived. The street I walked down was familiar, lined with old trees that swayed gently in the evening breeze. The houses on either side had that charming lived-in feel, with their warm windows flickering with the last rays of the sun I was so caught up in the tranquility of the evening that I didn't notice her at first. It was when I reached the crosswalk that I saw her. She was across the street, standing by the corner near the small cafe, her figure framed by the fading light. She was dressed in a simple coat, dark hair pulled back into a ponytail, her hands tucked into her pockets. As she stood still, at first I thought she was just another passerby waiting for the light to change, but then she did something that made me pause. She waved. It wasn't an exaggerated gesture, just a simple, friendly wave. Her hand rose slightly, the motion casual but deliberate. There was no mistaking it was waving at me. I stared across the street, confused. I didn't recognize her, and there was no reason she should have waved at me. I looked around quickly, half expecting to see someone behind me. Maybe someone she knew, but no. She was looking directly at me, her face soft but unreadable, and her waves still hung in the air between us. I glanced around once more, still unsure. Maybe it was a mistake, or perhaps I had crossed her path earlier without realizing it. The light turned green, and with a mix of curiosity and a slight sense of unease, I decided to cross. I walked briskly across the street, my shoes tapping against the asphalt, but as I neared the corner, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept my eyes fixed on the spot where I had seen her, half expecting her to be still standing there, but as I reached the opposite sidewalk and looked toward the cafe, she was gone. The space where she had been standing was empty. The cafe was quiet, the windows dimmed, and the street was just as calm as it had been before. I stopped, my feet frozen to the pavement. I searched the area for any sign of Hironi movement, any indication that she had stepped into the cafe or moved further down the street, but there was nothing, no trace of her at all. I stood there for a few moments, trying to convince myself that I had imagined Maybe it was just a fleeting moment, a trick of the light, but I was certain I had seen her. She had waved at me, and yet now she was nowhere to be found. I glanced around. Feeling an odd knot forming in my stomach, I turned back to the corner, retracing my steps, trying to make sense of what had happened. Maybe she had stepped inside the cafe, maybe she had simply walked away, but none of it made sense. There were no signs of movement anywhere. No one else around the street was still, almost too still. As though the moment had never happened, I walked on, my mind racing, trying to push away the unease that had settled into my chest. The rest of the walk home felt different, now darker. Somehow, even with the soft glow of streetlights beginning to flicker. On I kept, glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see her again, maybe following me, but she was gone. The rest of the street seemed more empty, more silent than it had before. When I reached my apartment, I didn't look back. I told myself it was nothing, just a coincidence, but the memory of her wave lingered, frozen in my mind. It wasn't a mistake, it wasn't a trick of the light, it was real. I still don't know who she was, or why she waved at me. I haven't seen her again, and I don't think I ever will, but sometimes late at night, when I walk that same street home, I can't help but glance toward that corner, and sometimes I feel like someone's watching me just out of sight. It was an unusually quiet Sunday afternoon, the kind of day when the world seems to slow down, and everything feels just a little too still. The air was crisp, the sky a soft shade of gray, threatening to rain, but never quite following through. I had spent the morning inside, trying to get some work done, but after a while I needed a break. So I decided to take a walk through the park near my apartment. It was one of those places where the hustle of the city seemed to fade away, where the trees and the open space gave you the illusion that you were somewhere far removed from everything. The park was only a few blocks away, and by the time I reached it, I was already feeling the weight of the day lift. I stepped through the entrance, and immediately felt the quiet embrace of the place. The leaves on the trees rustled softly in the wind, and the distant sound of a dog barking added a layer of peacefulness to the atmosphere. There was no one around, no families having picnics, no children running around. The benches were empty, and the playground, usually bustling with activity, was silent. I wandered down the winding path, the crunch of leaves beneath my feet, the only sound accompanying me. The air smelled like wet earth and pine, the scent of fall in full bloom. The stillness of the park was almost eerie, but it was a kind of eeriness I had always enjoyed. The world outside could be noisy and chaotic, but in this park, everything seemed to pause for a while. I took my time walking, letting the serenity of the place wash over me. The path curved toward the playground area where the swings were swaying gently in the breeze. Despite there being no one around, as I approached, I noticed something strange. One of the swings, the farthest one on the right, was moving. It was barely noticeable at first, but as I drew closer, I saw that it was gently rocking back and forth, as though someone had just been sitting on it, and had pushed off the ground lightly. Before standing up, I paused, my eyes fixed on the swing. It was a weird sensation, almost like the swing was still in motion from the moment the person had left. I told myself it was nothing, maybe just the wind or the way the ropes were creaking, but something in my gut told me there was more to it. I took a few steps forward, closer to the playground. The swing continued to sway, almost as if it were waiting for someone to come back and sit in it again, but no one was there. I glanced around the playground, searching for any sign of movement, but the space was still. The slide was empty, the jungle gym silent. There was no one else in the park. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I stood there just staring at the swing, feeling a chill creep up my spine. The air seemed colder now, and the peacefulness of the park had shifted into something heavier, something that felt unnatural. And then I saw it. From the corner of my eye, I noticed a figure sitting on the swing. At first it was only a brief glimpse, but when I turned my head fully to look, I saw them more clearly. A person sitting motionless on the swing, their back to me, their body just slightly slumped. It was as though they were blending into the shadows, a part of the stillness of the park. I couldn't make out any details at first, just the vague outline of someone sitting there. My breath caught in my throat. The park had been empty when I walked in. I had seen no one else around, but here in front of me was a figure sitting silently on the swing, as if they had been there the whole time. I stepped back, my heart beating faster now. The person on the swing didn't move, they didn't speak. They just sat there, their head lowered, their body still. I felt a deep, unnerving sensation in my chest. I wanted to call out to them to ask if they were okay, but the words felt stuck in my throat. The air felt thick, like I was standing in a space that didn't belong to me, like I had stumbled into something I wasn't supposed to see. I took a cautious step forward, my feet moving on their own, drawn to the swing, despite every instinct telling me to turn and run. I didn't know why, but I had to see who this person was, what they were doing here so alone, so still. As I took another step, I stopped. The swing was still moving, but the person wasn't there anymore. I blinked, my breath frozen in my chest. The swing was still rocking back and forth, the faint sound of the chains creaking in the wind, but there was no one sitting on it now. The figure had disappeared. Just like that one moment they were there, sitting perfectly still, and the next, there was nothing. I looked around again, my mind racing, trying to understand what had just happened. The park was still empty, the playground was silent, the swing slowly coming to a stop. I didn't move for a long time, standing there watching the swing. In the dimming light of the evening, the air was heavy. Now the weight of whatever had just occurred, pressing against my chest. It wasn't just the empty swing that unsettled me, it was the fact that I couldn't explain any of it. The person who had been there, who had just vanished before my eyes, where had they gone? How had they disappeared so quickly without a trace? I turned and walked away slowly, my steps heavy, my mind still racing with questions that I couldn't answer, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left behind in that park, something that had been watching me from the shadows. As I walked away, I glanced back one last time, but the playground was empty. The swing was still, the silence of the park thick around me, yet somewhere deep in my mind, I felt the eyes of the figure on me, even if I couldn't see them anymore. I haven't returned to that park since. Every time I pass by, I feel the pull of the swing, the lingering presence of someone watching, waiting in the shadows, and no matter how much I try to convince myself it was just my imagination, I can't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone that day. That something is still out there watching, waiting.